The air in the courtroom was thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. On one side sat Eleanor Vance, a woman carved from ice and dignity, her face a mask of impenetrable calm. Opposite her, her husband of 25 years, Richard, sat with his arm draped possessively around his young, vibrant mistress, Isabella Rossi. The tension finally snapped when Isabella, unable to contain her triumph, stood and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Eleanor. Her voice, sharp and dripping with venom, echoed off the polished wood walls for everyone to hear. "It's over, you old relic. He's mine now." A wave of shock rippled through the gallery. Richard smirked, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply turned to her lawyer and gave a quiet nod. He rose, and in his hand was a document that would not only end the marriage, but expose a conspiracy so dark it would shatter everyone's reality. The wife was about to play her final card, and it wasn't a divorce petition. It was a signed will. The Vance family lived a life curated for the pages of luxury magazines. Their estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, wasn't just a house. It was a sprawling testament to new money desperately trying to look old. A long, winding driveway, lined with ancient oaks they'd paid a fortune to import, led to a Georgian-style mansion that overlooked the Long Island Sound. Richard Vance, the patriarch, was the architect of this empire. He had built Vance Holdings from a modest tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. He was charismatic, ruthless, and possessed a brand of confidence so absolute it bordered on a religion. And at his side for 25 years had been Eleanor. To the outside world, she was the perfect corporate wife, elegant, poised, and impeccable hostess who chaired the right charities and raised two perfect children, Samuel and Lily, who were now away at elite universities. What the world didn't see, and what Richard had long forgotten, was that Eleanor wasn't just an accessory. She was the bedrock. Her inheritance had provided the seed money for his first venture. Her quiet counsel had steered him away from disastrous deals. Her social grace had smoothed over his brutish business tactics, winning him allies where he would have only made enemies. She was the silent partner in every sense of the word, the ghost in his success machine. But over the past few years, the gilded cage had begun to rust from the inside. The first signs were subtle. Richard, who once shared every detail of his day, became vague. Late meetings became a nightly occurrence. Business trips stretched from days into weeks, with calls becoming shorter and more perfunctory. He started wearing a new, flashier brand of cologne and favoring suits that were cut a little too tight, a little too youthful. He was a man running from his own age, and Eleanor knew she was a living reminder of the timeline he desperately wanted to erase. She wasn't a fool. She saw the signs, the little cracks in the facade of their perfect life. A credit card bill with a charge for a 5-star hotel in their own city. A stray earring, cheap and gaudy, found in the passenger seat of his Mercedes. A whispered phone call he thought she couldn't hear his voice, dropping to a low, intimate murmur that he hadn't used with her in a decade. The confirmation came not with a bang, but with the cold, sterile glow of a computer screen. One night, unable to sleep, Eleanor found Richard's personal laptop open on his desk. A chat window was still active. The name on the screen was Isabella Rossi. She was a junior marketing executive at Vance Holdings, 28 years old, with a mane of fiery red hair and an ambition that burned just as brightly. The messages were a sickening blend of saccharine pet names and explicit plans. They weren't just sleeping together. They were building a future that had no room for Eleanor. The most chilling message was from Isabella. "When are you finally going to get rid of the old ball and chain? I want it all, Richie. Your name, your house, You're everything." Richard's reply was a knife to Eleanor's heart. "Soon, my queen. Very soon. The lawyers are already drawing up the papers. She won't know what hit her." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage she might have expected. It was a cold, terrifying clarity. The man she had built a life with, the father of her children, was not just leaving her. He was plotting against her, reducing her to an obstacle, a ball and chain to be discarded. In that moment, something within her shifted. The grief was there, a deep tectonic pain, but it was quickly being encased in ice. If he wanted a war, she would not be a casualty. She would be the strategist. She closed the laptop, her hands steady. She went back to their master bedroom, the one they no longer truly shared, and looked at her reflection in the antique mirror. The world saw a woman who was about to lose everything. She saw a woman who had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. A week later, Richard came to her in their sunroom, the place where they had once shared lazy Sunday mornings with the kids. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. His face was a mask of cold resolve. "Eleanor," he began, foregoing any preamble, "this isn't working anymore. I want a divorce." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I see. I've met someone," he continued, as if this were a minor detail. "Isabella Rossi. You may have seen her at the company galas. We're in love." "Love?" Eleanor repeated the word, tasting it like poison. "Is that what you call it? Don't be difficult, Eleanor." He scoffed, his arrogance flaring. "This is happening. My lawyers will be in touch with yours. I'll be generous, of course. You'll be well taken care of. You can keep the summer house in the Hamptons. But this house, the company, that's all mine. It's time for me to start my real life." Eleanor stood up, her posture regal. "Your real life, Richard. You wouldn't have a life at all if it weren't for me. You wouldn't have a company. You wouldn't have this house." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, please, don't be melodramatic. You were a good partner for a time. But that time is over. Isabella understands me. She's vibrant, she's ambitious. She's the future. And I," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "am the past you wish to bury." Be careful what you wish for, Richard. Sometimes the past refuses to stay dead. He simply rolled his eyes, turning to leave. "Just have your lawyer call mine. The sooner we get this over with, the better." As he walked away, Eleanor felt the ice in her veins solidify into steel. He thought this was a simple transaction, a business deal where he held all the assets. He had no idea that she had just spent the last week not crying into her pillow, but making calls. She had hired the most discreet, most ruthless private investigator in the tri-state area. She had contacted an old friend, Arthur Finch, a lawyer known less for flashy courtroom theatrics and more for a mind like a steel trap. The war had begun, and Richard hadn't even realized his opponent was on the field. He saw a wife. He should have seen a queen defending her board. The divorce proceedings began, as Richard had intended, as a brutal one-sided assault. His legal team, a pack of slick, pinstriped sharks from a top Manhattan firm, descended with the clear objective of painting Eleanor as nothing more than a glorified dependent. They filed motions claiming she was a spendthrift with no concept of financial reality, citing her charity donations and household expenses as proof of her profligacy. They subpoenaed her friends, her caterers, even the gardener, hoping to dig up any dirt that would portray her as mentally unstable or an unfit mother, despite Samuel and Lily being adults. Richard, emboldened by Isabella's constant praise, was a monster of arrogance. On the stand during his deposition, he downplayed Eleanor's contributions to his success with contemptuous ease. "My wife's role was primarily social," he stated, leaning into the microphone. "She planned parties. She was very good at it. But to suggest she had any hand in the strategic direction of Vance Holdings is frankly laughable. I built that company with my own 2 hands." Isabella was a constant presence, sitting just behind the lawyers, her expression a smug mask of victory. She attended every meeting, every deposition she was allowed into. She would touch Richard's arm, whisper in his ear, and cast triumphant glances at Eleanor. She had already moved into the Greenwich mansion, redecorating with a garish taste that favored leopard print and gold fixtures. She posted photos of herself on social media, lounging by their pool, driving his cars, wearing jewelry from his vault, some of which had been anniversary gifts to Eleanor. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to break Eleanor's spirit. But Eleanor did not break. She remained serene, her composure a silent rebuke to their vulgarity. Her lawyer, Arthur Finch, was her perfect counterpart. A man in his late 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Arthur was the epitome of quiet competence. He met their loud, aggressive tactics with calm, meticulous preparation. He countered their motions with detailed financial records, proving Eleanor's initial investment and subsequent fiscal prudence. He presented affidavits from former board members who recalled Eleanor's insightful contributions in the company's early days. "They're playing checkers, Eleanor," Arthur told her one afternoon in his wood-paneled office. "Loud, obvious moves. We're playing chess, and our time will come." It was during this period of immense stress that something else began to happen. Eleanor started feeling perpetually tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. She lost weight. A persistent dry cough settled in her chest. At first, she dismissed it as the physical toll of the divorce. But one morning, she coughed into a handkerchief and saw a small, bright fleck of red. A cold dread entirely different from the one Richard had inspired washed over her. She made an appointment with a top oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering, under an assumed name, paying in cash to avoid any paper trail that Richard's lawyers could find. The tests were extensive, the waiting agonizing. Finally, the doctor sat her down in a sterile, sunless room. The look on his face told her everything before he even spoke. The diagnosis was grim late-stage lung cancer, aggressive, inoperable. "With intensive treatment," the doctor said gently, "we might be able to manage it for a time. But you should be realistic, Mrs. Smith. It would be wise to get your affairs in order." Eleanor received the news with the same chilling calm she had shown Richard. This, she thought, was the universe's cruelest joke. After all her planning, all her fight, her own body was betraying her in the most final way imaginable. She walked out of the hospital into the bustling New York City streets, feeling completely detached, as if she were watching a movie of her own life. She grieved that night alone in the small, discreet apartment she had rented. She allowed herself one night to feel the crushing weight of it all. The fear, the injustice, the sorrow for the future with her children that was being stolen from her. But as dawn broke, the steel returned. The diagnosis wasn't just a death sentence. It was a weapon. It was the final perfect piece of her strategy, one she would never have chosen, but would not hesitate to use. The next day she met with Arthur Finch. She told him everything. He listened without interruption, his face impassive, but his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful empathy. "My God, Eleanor," he said softly when she finished. "What do you want to do?" We can use this. A sympathy play in court. No, Eleanor said firmly. No sympathy. I will not be pitied, especially not by them. We will do the opposite. We keep this a complete secret. No one knows. Not my children, not my friends, no one. Arthur looked puzzled. But why? Because. Eleanor explained, a flicker of grim fire in her eyes. Richard and Isabella believe time is on their side. They think they can just wait me out, grind me down until I accept their pittance of an offer. They are praying for my future to end, so theirs can begin. I'm going to give them exactly what they want. Or rather, I'm going to let them think they're getting it. From that moment, the plan evolved. Eleanor, guided by Arthur, began making new arrangements. The most important of these was her will. She drafted a new last will and testament, leaving the vast majority of her personal fortune, which was still substantial from her family's side, to her children. Samuel and Lily placed in a secure trust. She also included specific bequests to her most loyal friends and staff. But her private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Dave, had been busy. He wasn't just digging into Richard's finances. Eleanor had tasked him with focusing on Isabella. A woman that ambitious doesn't appear out of nowhere, she'd told him. Find out where she came from. Find out who she talks to. Dave's findings were interesting. Isabella came from a working-class background in Queens. She had a mountain of debt from student loans and credit cards. But more curiously, in the months leading up to her affair with Richard becoming public, she had received several large, untraceable cash deposits into a new bank account. And she was in frequent contact with a man named Marcus Thorne. The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne had been Richard's first business partner, a brilliant but volatile software engineer. The two had a spectacular falling out a decade ago. Richard had forced him out of the company, buying his shares for a fraction of their eventual worth. Thorne had been ruined, bankrupted, and had sworn revenge. He had disappeared from their social and professional circles, but the hatred he harbored for Richard was legendary. Isabella and Marcus Thorne. Arthur said, his brow furrowed. That can't be a coincidence. It's not, Eleanor replied. Isabella is his Trojan horse. The theory was audacious. Thorne, wanting revenge, had found the perfect tool in the beautiful, greedy Isabella. He was likely funding her, guiding her, pushing her to secure Richard, get him to divorce Eleanor, and then, once married, somehow gain control of his assets. Richard, blinded by his ego and lust, was a lamb being led to slaughter, thinking he was the wolf. But they needed proof, and they needed a way to expose it all at once, in a way that would leave no doubt. They're getting sloppy, Eleanor, Arthur said, reviewing the investigator's report. They think they've already won. Richard is letting Isabella sit in on high-level financial meetings. He's even given her power of attorney for some minor accounts as a sign of his trust. A dark, brilliant idea began to form in Eleanor's mind. It was risky, almost unthinkable. Arthur, she said, slowly, her mind racing. Richard has an annual physical next week. It's mandatory for the company's key man insurance policy. Isabella will surely be with him. I need Dave to find out everything about that appointment. The doctor, the clinic, everything. She then turned to another task. She had a meeting with a lawyer. Not Arthur Finch, but a different kind of lawyer, one recommended to her by Dave. A lawyer who specialized in creating documents that looked impeccable but served a hidden purpose. The stage was being set. Richard and Isabella were swaggering towards the finish line of their divorce, ready to claim their prize. They had no idea that Eleanor, armed with the knowledge of her own mortality and a thirst for justice, had already laid a minefield right at their feet. The final act was about to begin, and it would take place in the one venue they felt most secure, the public stage of the courtroom. The day of the final hearing arrived cloaked in a grey, oppressive humidity that mirrored the atmosphere inside courtroom 4B. The room was packed. The Vance divorce had become a spectator sport among the Greenwich elite, and the gallery was a sea of familiar faces, friends, business rivals, and gossips, all eager to witness the final humiliation of Eleanor Vance. Richard arrived with Isabella clinging to his arm. He was tanned and beaming, looking every bit the victor. He wore a bespoke navy suit, a power statement. Isabella was a vision in blood-red silk, a dress that was both expensive and predatory. She scanned the room, her smile sharp and possessive, her eyes briefly locking with Eleanor's across the room. She offered a small, condescending smirk. Eleanor, by contrast, was an island of quiet composure. She wore a simple, elegant grey dress, her only adornment a string of pearls Richard had given her on their 10th anniversary, a subtle, poignant choice. She looked thinner, more fragile than before, and there were dark circles under her eyes that even her makeup couldn't fully conceal. Richard and Isabella likely saw it as proof of her defeat, the physical manifestation of a broken heart. They had no idea it was the shadow of a far greater battle being waged within her. Arthur Finch sat beside her, his briefcase resting on his lap. He gave her a reassuring look. "All the pieces are in place, Eleanor. Just stay strong." The proceedings droned on through the morning. Richard's lawyers presented their final arguments, painting him as a generous man being taken advantage of, and Eleanor as a bitter woman clinging to a lifestyle she hadn't earned. When Richard's lead attorney, a slick man named Peterson, concluded with, "Mr. Vance simply wants to move on with his life, with the woman he loves, and provide a fair but realistic settlement to his former wife." Richard reached over and squeezed Isabella's hand. Judge Albright, a stern woman with a reputation for no-nonsense justice, listened impassively. She then turned her gaze to Arthur Finch. "Mr. Finch, your response." Arthur rose slowly. "Your Honor, we contend that this is not a simple case of a marriage ending. We contend that the foundation of this divorce is built on a conspiracy of greed and deception, and that Mrs. Vance is not the one being unreasonable. In fact, she is the one being systematically targeted." Peterson jumped to his feet. "Objection, Mr. Finch is spinning baseless fantasies. There is no conspiracy." "On the contrary," Arthur said calmly, "there is, and the lead conspirator is sitting right there." He gestured not to Richard, but directly to Isabella. A gasp went through the courtroom. Isabella's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. He can't just accuse me of things." "Settle down, Ms. Rossi." Judge Albright warned, her voice sharp. "You are a guest in this courtroom. Miss Finch, you're making a serious allegation. You'd better have more than theories." "I do, Your Honor," Arthur said. "But before I present our evidence, I believe Miss Rossi has something she'd like to say. She seems quite eager to contribute." He looked directly at Isabella, a challenge in his eyes. It was the perfect bait. Isabella, brimming with arrogance, and seeing this as her moment to publicly stake her claim, fell for it completely. She couldn't help herself. All the pent-up resentment, all the triumph she felt, came bubbling to the surface. She stood up, her red dress like a slash of blood in the muted courtroom. Richard tried to pull her back down, whispering, "Isabella, no." But she shook him off. She pointed a trembling, furious finger across the room at Eleanor. Her voice, shrill and laced with venom, pierced the silence. "You're damn right I have something to say. This whole thing is a joke. You lost Eleanor. Do you hear me? You are old news, a relic. He doesn't want you. He wants me. He loves me. She turned her head, her fiery hair whipping around, and gestured wildly at the mansion, the company, everything. All of this. It was never really yours. You were just keeping it warm for me. It's our time now. He's mine now. The final declaration. He's mine now. Hung in the air, an admission so brazen, so shocking, that the entire room fell into a stunned silence. Reporters in the back furiously scribbled in their notepads. Richard's face had gone pale, a mask of horror replacing his smug grin. He had completely lost control. Judge Albright's face was thunderous. Ms. Rossi, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed for contempt of court. Your outburst has been noted for the record. Isabella, suddenly realizing her catastrophic mistake, sank back into her chair, her face ashen. But Eleanor didn't react with anger or hurt. Instead, a look of profound, chilling calm settled on her features. This was the moment, the checkmate she had been waiting for. She leaned over and whispered to Arthur. Now. Arthur Finch nodded grimly. He turned back to the judge, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the residual shock in the room. Your Honor, in light of Ms. Rossi's very public declaration of her perceived partnership with Mr. Vance and her future intentions regarding his estate, her statement serves as a crucial piece of context for our next exhibit. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers bound in a neat legal cover. He walked to the clerk and handed it over. We would like to submit this document into evidence. Peterson Richards' lawyer was on his feet again. Objection. What is this? The discovery period is over. We haven't seen this document. It is a new development, counsel, Arthur replied smoothly. One that only became relevant in the last 48 hours. I believe the court will find it most illuminating. Judge Albright took the document from the clerk. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the first page. A flicker of utter astonishment crossed her face. She looked up first at Richard, then at Isabella, and finally at Eleanor. The judge's expression was no longer just stern, it was deeply troubled. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice low and serious. Can you explain to the court what this document is? Arthur looked at Richard, whose face was now a canvas of confusion and dawning dread. Certainly, Your Honor, Arthur said, his voice resonating with gravitas. The document you are holding is the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Vance. A wave of confusion swept the room. A will. Why was that relevant in a divorce? And, the judge prompted. It was signed 2 days ago, Your Honor, Arthur continued. It names a new primary beneficiary to his entire estate, including all controlling shares in Vance Holdings in the event of his death. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He then turned his gaze upon Isabella Rossi, who looked like she had seen a ghost. It leaves everything, Arthur announced, his voice like the tolling of a bell, to Miss Isabella Rossi. Chaos erupted. Richard stared open-mouthed, first at Arthur, then at Isabella, a look of profound betrayal dawning on his face. What I never, he stammered. But you did, Richard, Eleanor said, speaking for the first time, her voice soft but carrying across the courtroom. You signed it, right after your physical. The lawyer Isabella so helpfully recommended said it was just a formality. A simple update to your living will, didn't she? Judge? Albright slammed her gavel down. Order. Order in this court. She looked down at the document again, then at the signature page. It was clearly Richard Vance's signature, notarized and witnessed. Then she looked back at Arthur Finch, a silent question in her eyes. How did you get this? And what does it really mean? The trap had been sprung. The will wasn't just a document about a future inheritance. It was the key that would unlock a conspiracy of attempted murder. And Eleanor Vance had just handed it to the judge. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of confusion and suspicion. Richard Vance looked at Isabella, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. A will? What are they talking about? I didn't sign a will. Isabella's face was chalky white. Richie, darling, it's a misunderstanding. They're lying. It was just an update to your healthcare proxy. The lawyer said. Her voice trailed off as she saw the predatory stillness in Arthur Finch's eyes. She knew in that moment that she was caught. Your Honor, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the noise. If you'll examine the witnesses on the signature page, you'll find they were a notary and a paralegal from a firm I'm quite certain Mr. Vance has never heard of. A firm, however, that has received substantial payments from one Mr. Marcus Thorne. The name dropped like a bomb. Richard flinched as if he'd been struck. Thorne. What the hell does he have to do with this? Everything, Arthur stated flatly. He turned to face Richard directly. Mr. Vance, you recently had your annual physical, did you not? At the Kensington private clinic. Yes, Richard answered, bewildered. For my insurance policy. And Ms. Rossi accompanied you, correct? She insisted on being there for moral support. Yes, she was there. So what? And after your examination, Arthur continued, his tone methodical, like a surgeon making incisions. While you were still feeling a bit groggy from the sedative you were given for a minor endoscopic procedure you underwent? Ms. Rossi introduced you to a lawyer. She said it was urgent a chance to update some paperwork while you were there. She presented you with a stack of documents, told you it was a standard living will and healthcare directive, and you signed them. Is that not what happened? The color drained from Richard's face. He remembered. The blurriness, the nurse telling him he'd feel a little out of it for a few hours. He remembered Isabella's insistent whispering, guiding his hand as he scrawled his name on page after page. She said it was to make her my emergency contact, he stammered, looking at Isabella with pure terror. She is much more than your emergency contact in this document, Mr. Vance, Judge Albright said grimly, holding up the will. She is your sole heir. But that's not the most disturbing part, Your Honor, Arthur interjected. The why is far more important than the how. He signaled to an assistant who wheeled a presentation board into the courtroom. For the past 2 months, my client, Mrs. Vance, has had a private investigator looking into Ms. Rossi and her associates. The first board showed large, blown-up bank statements. These are the accounts of Ms. Isabella Rossi. For a junior executive on a $60,000 salary, she lives quite well. That's because she was receiving monthly cash deposits funneled through a series of shell corporations. The source of those funds, Marcus Thorne. The second board showed phone records, hundreds of calls and encrypted texts between Isabella and Thorne, dating back over a year, long before she and Richard had even started their affair. Their plan was simple yet diabolical. Arthur explained, his voice ringing with authority. Mr. Thorne, seeking revenge for his financial ruin at the hands of Mr. Vance, recruited Ms. Rossi. Her job was to seduce Mr. Vance, convince him to divorce his wife, cutting off the one person who truly watched his back, and then marry him. The will was the final piece of the puzzle. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Once Miss Rosie was legally his wife and sole heir, Mr. Vance's life expectancy would have plummeted dramatically. "This is insane," Peterson Richards' lawyer shouted. "You have no proof of any intent to harm—" "Don't I?" Arthur shot back. He pulled another file from his briefcase. "This is a sworn affidavit from a nurse at the Kensington Clinic. She was on duty during Mr. Vance's procedure. She states that Ms. Rosie showed an unusual and persistent interest in Mr. Vance's post-procedure medication. Specifically, she kept asking if he was prescribed blood thinners for his heart condition. When the nurse confirmed he was Ms. Rosie, asked for the specific dosage and brand name, claiming she wanted to help manage his prescriptions. Arthur then presented a report from a toxicologist. "We also have this. My investigator obtained the vial of vitamin B12 shots that Ms. Rosie had so thoughtfully prepared for Mr. Vance to boost his energy during the stress of the divorce. It contains no B12. It contains a highly concentrated, unregulated anticoagulant, a substance that, when combined with his prescribed blood thinner, would have induced a massive, untraceable cerebral hemorrhage within weeks. A tragic accident." The courtroom was utterly silent. The sheer cold-bloodedness of the plot was breathtaking. Richard Vance wasn't just losing his wife. He was the prize in a deadly game he never even knew he was playing. His swagger, his arrogance, his entire world-view shattered in that instant. He was not the master of the universe. He was a fool, a pawn, a target. He slowly turned his head to look at Isabella. The beautiful, vibrant woman he had lauded as his future was now a monster. Her face was a contorted mask of fear and fury. Their eyes met, and in his there was no love. No anger, just the primal terror of a man who has stared into his own grave. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You were going to kill me." Isabella didn't answer. She lunged to her feet and made a desperate dash for the courtroom doors. But two burly court officers, anticipating the move on a signal from Judge Albright, intercepted her easily. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, her facade of sophistication completely gone, revealing the desperate creature beneath. "He's lying. It's all lies." As they restrained her, Judge Albright's voice cut through the chaos cold as a winter wind. "Isabella Rossi, you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. Marcus Thorne was apprehended by police less than an hour ago. He is already cooperating." The trap had not just been sprung. It had snapped shut with brutal finality. As Isabella was led away, sobbing and screaming, all eyes turned to Eleanor. She hadn't moved. She hadn't gloated. She simply watched the destruction she had so meticulously orchestrated her expression, one of profound, sorrowful victory. Richard stared at her, his face a ruin of shame and regret. He had tried to discard her, to cast her aside like a broken object, but she had been the only one standing between him and a horrific death. He had called her a relic of the past, but she had just saved his future, and in doing so she had taken everything from him, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The great Richard Vance was finally utterly unraveled. With Isabella's hysterical shrieks fading down the hallway, a new kind of silence fell upon the courtroom. The heavy, weighted silence of consequence. The gallery, which had assembled for a society scandal, had instead witnessed the anatomy of a murder plot. The reporters were no longer scribbling gossip. They were documenting a story that would lead the national news. Judge Albright surveyed the scene, her face etched with disgust. She looked at Richard, who was slumped in his chair, a broken man. His expensive suit now seemed like a costume on a scarecrow. His lawyer Peterson stood beside him, utterly defeated, the wind knocked out of his sails. "Mr. Peterson," the judge said, her voice devoid of any warmth, "in light of the evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder presented here today, all of which directly involves your client as the intended victim and his assets as the motive, I am finding it impossible to proceed with this divorce hearing as planned. The circumstances have fundamentally changed." She took off her glasses and rubbed her temples. "The immediate concern of this court is no longer the division of assets, but the preservation of them from criminal enterprise and the protection of the Vance family." She turned her gavel over in her hand. "Therefore, I am making the following rulings effective immediately." Every word landed like a hammer blow. "First, all civil proceedings in this divorce are hereby stayed. Instead, I am invoking the court's power to issue an emergency order. All personal and corporate assets of Richard Vance and Vance Holdings are hereby frozen pending a full criminal investigation and a forensic audit to determine the extent of Marcus Thorne's infiltration and Isabella Rossi's fraudulent activities." Richard's head shot up. "Frozen, Your Honor." "You can't. My company." "Your company, Mr. Vance," the judge cut him off, "was nearly used as the prize in your own murder. The board and the shareholders need to be protected from your catastrophic lack of judgment. Second," she continued, "given the clear and present danger you invited into your home and your life, I find that you have acted with extreme negligence concerning the well-being of your family. Therefore, I am awarding sole and exclusive use of the Greenwich family residence to Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Third, full and sole legal and physical custody of your 2 children, Samuel and Lily, is granted to Mrs. Vance. While they are adults, this ruling pertains to all legal matters of guardianship and inheritance trusts until the criminal case is resolved. Finally," she said, looking directly at Richard, "your petition for divorce from Mrs. Vance is denied. However, Mrs. Vance's counter-petition is granted on the grounds of extreme cruelty and endangerment. But the financial settlement will be determined after the criminal investigation reveals what, if anything, is left of your fortune once the fraud has been untangled. Based on the evidence of conspiracy to defraud the company, I suspect it will be substantially less than you imagine." She banged the gavel, the sound echoing the finality of a coffin lid closing. "This court is adjourned." Richard Vance sat motionless, staring into the void. He had lost everything. Not his money that was just frozen. He had lost his pride, his reputation, his family's trust, and his self-respect. He had been played for a fool on the grandest stage imaginable, and the woman he had tried to destroy had saved his life only to preside over the complete dismantling of it. Later that evening, Eleanor sat in the quiet library of the Greenwich home, her home now. The gaudy trinkets Isabella had littered about the place had already been packed into boxes for disposal. Arthur Finch sat opposite her, a glass of single malt scotch in his hand. "It's done, Eleanor," he said softly. "You did it. You saved him, and you saved the company." Eleanor stared into the unlit fireplace. "I didn't do it for him, Arthur. I did it for my children. I did it so that Snake and her puppet master wouldn't steal their legacy." "And what about you?" Arthur asked, his voice gentle. "We never spoke of it again, but your diagnosis. How are you truly?" Eleanor allowed a small, tired smile to touch her lips for the first time in months. This was the final piece of the story, the one only she and Arthur knew. "It's a funny thing, the power of a diagnosis," she said. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a medical file, a different one from the one she had first shown him. I did have a spot on my lung. It showed up on the initial scan. The first doctor, the one I saw under an assumed name, was overly pessimistic. He saw an older woman stressed and jumped to the worst conclusion. She opened the file. After I told you, you insisted I get a second opinion with a specialist you trusted, Dr. Matthews. He performed a biopsy. It wasn't cancer, Arthur. It was a benign nodule, a scar from a bout of pneumonia I had years ago. The exhaustion, the cough. It was all stress, the sheer crushing weight of what he was doing to me. Arthur stared at her, his mind reeling. So you knew you weren't dying. For how long? I've known for 6 weeks, she admitted. But Richard and Isabella didn't know that. They saw what they wanted to see, a weak, fading woman. They underestimated me. They all did. My illness made them reckless. It made them accelerate their plans. It made them sign that will. It was the perfect cover. I was the frail, dying wife. Who would ever suspect I was hunting them? Arthur shook his head in disbelief, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the most brilliant, audacious, and ruthless legal maneuver he had ever witnessed. She had taken a potential tragedy and weaponized it, using her enemy's own cruelty and assumptions against them. She hadn't just played chess. She had invented a whole new game. A sound at the door made them both turn. Her children, Samuel and Lily, stood there. They had been called home from university and told everything. Their faces were pale with shock. But as they looked at their mother sitting there, not as a victim, but as a warrior, their expressions softened into awe and overwhelming love. They rushed to her, wrapping her in their arms. "Mom," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We are so sorry. We didn't see what was happening." Eleanor held them tight, the cold steel inside her finally melting away, replaced by the warmth of her children's love. "It's over now," she whispered, her own voice finally catching. "It's all over." She was no longer Mrs. Richard Vance, the corporate wife. She was Eleanor Vance, the woman who had faced down betrayal, conspiracy, and even the shadow of death, and had emerged not just victorious, but reborn. The reckoning was complete. The year that followed the explosive courtroom hearing was not one of quiet healing, but of public dissection. The trial of the Black Widow of Wall Street, as the tabloids quickly dubbed Isabella Rossi, became the most sensational legal drama of the decade. The media circus was relentless. Every detail of her affair with Richard, every text message from Marcus Thorne, every cold-blooded calculation was laid bare for public consumption. Isabella at first tried to play the victim. She arrived at court each day in carefully chosen demure outfits, her face a mask of tearful innocence. But under the prosecutor's relentless, methodical questioning, her facade crumbled. Her testimony was a disaster of contradictions and panicked lies. When confronted with the recording of her own triumphant courtroom declaration, "He's mine now," she finally broke, devolving into a tirade that sealed her fate, blaming Eleanor, blaming Richard, blaming everyone but herself. Marcus Thorne was the prosecution's star witness. He took the stand not with remorse, but with a chilling intellectual detachment. He detailed his decade-long grudge against Richard, explaining how he'd identified Isabella as the perfect weapon, beautiful, greedy, and underestimated. Richard Vance's greatest weakness was never his finances, Thorne stated coolly, looking directly at the jury. It was his ego. He needed to believe he was desired by a woman like Isabella. I didn't have to convince her to kill him. I just had to convince her that his death was the only way to make her inheritance ironclad. She was in that regard an eager student. The most humiliating spectacle, however, was Richard's testimony. Called as the primary witness against the woman he once claimed to love, he was forced to recount every sordid detail of their affair. He had to read his own fawning, foolish messages aloud. He had to describe in excruciating detail how he had belittled his wife, plotted to discard her, and eagerly welcomed the architects of his own near demise into his life. He was a lion who had been declawed and disgraced in the center of the arena, a walking monument to his own stupidity. On the final day of his testimony, as he stepped down from the stand, he chanced a look at Eleanor, who sat in the front row. There was no triumph in her eyes, no pity. There was nothing. It was this absolute indifference he would later realize that was the cruelest cut of all. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, guilty on all counts. As Isabella was sentenced to 25 years to life, her composure shattered completely, and she had to be physically supported as she was led away. Marcus Thorne accepted his 20-year sentence with a wry, unrepentant smirk. The drama was over. For Richard, the drama was just beginning. The forensic audit of Vance Holdings was a bloodbath. It revealed a web of fraudulent contracts and shell companies so extensive that it was a miracle the company hadn't already collapsed. To stave off bankruptcy and a barrage of shareholder lawsuits, an emergency board meeting was called. Richard walked into the boardroom he had commanded for a quarter-century and was met with a wall of cold, unforgiving faces. He was formally stripped of his title as CEO and forced to sell his controlling shares at a severely reduced price to a new investment consortium. His reign was over. His social life evaporated overnight. He was expelled from his country club for conduct unbecoming a member. Old friends and business associates would cross the street to avoid him. He once attended a charity gala, a desperate attempt to signal normalcy, only to find himself standing utterly alone, a pariah in a tuxedo. His loneliness was a palpable force. He made painful, awkward attempts to connect with his children. He called Samuel one evening, trying to talk about a new market trend, a pathetic attempt to reclaim their old dynamic. Samuel's reply was polite but glacial. "If you have insights regarding the company, Dad, you should direct them to the chairwoman. She makes the final decisions." The chairwoman. That was Eleanor now. While Richard faded into ignominy, Eleanor rose with a quiet, formidable grace. She stepped into the role not with fanfare, but with purpose. Her first act as chairwoman of the board was to reopen a sustainable technology division that Richard had mockingly shuttered 5 years prior, calling it Eleanor's pet project. She had always believed in it. With her guidance and funding within a year, the division patented a new water purification technology that became immensely profitable and globally significant. It was a stunning vindication of the vision he had ridiculed. She brought her children into the fold, not as Nepo babies, but as valued colleagues. Samuel, with his sharp financial mind, became CFO. Lily, a natural marketer with a keen sense of social responsibility, headed the new philanthropic foundation. The Vance Holdings boardroom, once a den of chest-thumping egos, became a place of collaboration and respect. Eleanor didn't rule with fear. She led with wisdom, her deep institutional knowledge of the company proving to be its greatest asset. She poured her newfound influence into her foundation, focusing on a cause that now held a deep personal resonance, creating shelters and providing legal aid for women escaping financially abusive and coercive relationships. She was giving other women the tools to fight back the tools she had been forced to forge for herself. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost 2 years after the trial, Eleanor was in the gardens of her Greenwich estate. The chaotic, ostentatious plantings favoured by Richard had been replaced with elegant, structured beds of English roses and lavender. The garden was a reflection of her calm, beautiful and thriving. She was no longer just surviving. She was flourishing. She thought of Richard not with anger, but with a distant, clinical pity. He had been a chapter in her life, a storm she had weathered. He was not her defining story. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a group text from Samuel and Lily. It contained a photo of the two of them standing in front of a new building in Singapore, the company's Asian headquarters. They were both beaming, holding a plaque between them. The text below the image read, "The Eleanor Vance Innovation Center is officially open. The next chapter begins. All because of you, Mum. We love you." A slow, genuine smile spread across Eleanor's face. She looked at the picture of her children, confident and happy, building a future on the foundation she had secured for them. She looked around at her peaceful, orderly garden. The war was long over. The ghosts were gone. This wasn't a gilded cage anymore. It was simply home. It was a new dawn, and for the first time in a very long time, she was looking forward to the sunrise. There are moments in life that test the very core of who we are. For Eleanor Vance, that moment came when she was publicly discarded, underestimated, and targeted by those she should have been able to trust the most. But this story isn't just about the shocking greed of a mistress or the blind arrogance of a husband. It's a powerful testament to the quiet, unshakable strength that lies within those who are counted out. It's a reminder that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the most powerful, and that justice sometimes isn't about revenge. It's about meticulously, brilliantly taking back your life. If you were moved by Eleanor's incredible story of strategy and survival, and if you believe in the power of intelligence over brute force, show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more true stories of unexpected triumphs and justice served. Thank you for listening.